Today we're going to be testing out 4 different games on the Steam Deck OLED, and we're going to go from low all the way to the Ultra settings. The concept is simple. I go through every available preset that a game gives us. So that's typically low, medium, high, ultra. People loved the last one and they asked for a couple different games. One of those was Hogwarts Legacy, so that is going to be on the list today. But we're also going to check out Jedi Fallen Order and Hellblade. Alright, let's do this. We're going to start off with Hogwarts Legacy. I'm just going to go through and make sure all these settings are correct. We're at 800p resolution. Our frame rates are as high as they can go, just in case we can get that 90 frames per second, but I doubt it. They have a recommended quality preset. So this is going to be the first one that we start with. Again, we're going to go through each one of those presets. For a starting point, recommended is starting off pretty strong. Every once in a while, it has some pretty big dips, but then it also goes beyond 60, almost hitting 70 frames per second. But we're always above 45 frames per second in this and chilling in that 60-ish area for a lot of the time. If you wanted a more consistent experience, you could just cap off your frame rates at like 40, maybe 45 frames per second, and it might do better there. All right, next on the list is low. This is everything set to low. One would conclude that logically, we should get the best frames per second with these settings. So let's jump in and see. We seem to be staying above that 55 frames per second and jumping even into the high 60s. So it doesn't seem to be dipping down as low with everything on low. And honestly, it still looks really good. I would absolutely play this game on these settings if I wanted to be closer to that 60 frames per second or mid 50s. It's just right there. It's like almost 60 frames per second, which would be so awesome. So low is a really good option, but now it's time to put it through a little bit more of a stress test, bump things up to medium. These global quality presets are very global. They literally just set everything to the thing you're setting it to. And already this is saying that they basically don't recommend medium, but we're gonna do it anyways. And already, I'm a little confused why they're telling me that I shouldn't do this. They're saying it's exceeding its ability, but we're still 45 frames per second and higher, getting way into the high 50s. This is another candidate of maybe locking it in to 45 frames per second. We are getting dips below 45 frames per second, so that might not be the best either. So for science, let's just push this all the way down to 45, see if it can give it any help to get a little bit more consistent. And we are still unable to maintain a 45 frames per second stronghold. It's dipping way down, which is unfortunate. But then it stabilizes every once in a while. I'd say it's definitely playable at this, but capping the frame rate at 45, it probably would need to get capped a little bit below that, like down to 40 even. With that, this game is definitely playable at medium. So now, is it playable at high settings? Again, everything's just getting turned to high, and it definitely doesn't encourage you to do this on the Steam Deck. But let's see. Maybe we can. Sometimes the Steam Deck does surprising things, like what we're seeing right now. 45 frames per second there, dipping down to 30. Ooh, it went to 29 there for a second. But in all reality, this is very playable. It's not stuttering, it's not having too difficult of a time, it's staying closer to the 40 frames per second most of the time. So this is actually very playable on the Steam Deck at high settings, which is pretty awesome. The Steam Deck seems to just always be swinging and just proving people wrong, so we're gonna go to Ultra. We're gonna apply these settings and pray to the Valve gods. And what do you know? Consistently above 30 frames per second, jumping into 42 frames per second. We are at Ultra settings right now. Just flat across the board. We had a little dip there right at like the 27 frames per second for a moment, but it's really quite smooth and playing really well. I'm honestly very impressed right now. We're at ultra settings in a new AAA game, and it's playing above 30 frames per second. So now what we need to do is cap the frame rate at 30 and see if we can get a more consistent 30 frames per second. I'm gonna do it both on the Steam Deck and on the in-game just to make sure that nothing funky is happening. Come on, little Steam Deck.
My cousin was transfigured into a mouse.
Okay, that's a little bit of a rough start. It went all the way down to 25 frames per second. It's really trying to do this. But interesting enough, capping it at 30 frames per second, we seem to be getting more mid-20s and high 20s and less 30 plus. So potentially, when you're at ultra settings, not capping it could be helpful. Or am I missing something? So far, everything has been FSR2 balanced, but now we're gonna bump it to ultra performance to see if we can get this 30 frames per second going. And this is ridiculous. Not only does it look like garbage, it looks so bad, but it seems to be performing either about the same or worse. It's about the same. So we're getting like no increase in performance, but the image quality has just tanked. It is significantly worse looking than the lowest possible settings that you could do. Yeah, so I definitely don't recommend that. Now I want to jump back up to 90 hertz and then go back into the settings, turn everything back to low, and then go back and have the FSR2 set to ultra performance. So this is what we would maybe deem ultra low settings. This is just to see how many frames per second can we get out of this game. Well, well, well. If you go back and look at our first test on low, we were getting in the mid 50s, and now we're jumping all the way into the mid 70s every once in a while, but consistently more in the mid 60s. So we're getting like a 10 frame per second increase. But this all comes at the cost of some pretty bad quality. So I don't think I would play it this way. Oh, hey there. Wow, look at you. There's just something I needed to tell you. Would love for you to subscribe. That's all. That's it. That's all I wanted to tell you. Okay, back to the video. The next game that we're gonna jump into is Jedi Fallen Order. They don't have a low setting. It starts on medium. This game looks and plays awesome on the Steam Deck. I don't know why I haven't played it a little bit more than I have. But at medium, aka low, it's getting around 50 frames per second and feels great. Having AAA games that come right out of the box with an option of medium, and you can just play it and not think about it, is perfect. Now, if it had a real low setting and it could hit the 60 frames per second, that would be even better. But this is still good. So now we're gonna bump things up to high. I'm feeling pretty good about this game. And so as we can see, there is a major difference in frames per second from medium to high. We're really not even getting above that 40 frames per second. But I'm not complaining. At high settings, as long as it's not stuttering and having major issues, we're getting like a tiny bit of that, but overall, it's playing really smooth and it's staying above the 35 frames and in that high 30, which is not too bad. It's time for the final boss, Epic settings. Okay. So, it's like so badly wants to stay above 30 frames per second, but we definitely had a little bit of a dip. But again, guys, we're at epic settings. You can't even get this to look any better. This is as high as it can go. And now we just hit 40 frames per second and are pretty consistently in the mid 30s. So maybe that was just it kind of getting everything ready in the beginning there, because now it is absolutely staying above 30 frames per second. So I'm going to cap the hertz at 30 and see if that can give us a more consistent 30 frames per second with no dips below that. because if you really want to have the best quality, you could play this game on the Steam Deck at 30 frames per second and have a good experience, which is pretty much what we're seeing right here. I mean, if quality is your #1 importance, this game you can definitely play at epic settings. You could just cap yourself at 30 frames per second and you're good to go. This game looks great on the Steam Deck. Now let's jump back into the settings, turn on dynamic resolution scaling, go to medium, and we're gonna see how many frames per second we can get out of this bad boy. All right, let's go. This is now utilizing the OLED's 90 hertz screen because it's going all the way up into the 80s, consistently staying above 60 and getting into those low 80 frames per second on a handheld. The Steam Deck of all handhelds. Obviously, you're taking a hit to the resolution. It's not as crisp, but the frame rates are pretty dang awesome. Let's see how much of a difference this can make in the epic quality settings. And what do you know? Pushing into the 70 frames per second on epic settings. Little dip into the high 50, mid 50s there, but more often than not, we're in about the 60 frames per second arena at epic settings. All these little software tricks like this dynamic resolution scaling and FSR are such game changers for the handheld PC gaming market, and I'm very excited for the future of all of them. Now we're gonna jump into Hellblade, get all these set to low, and see what we can get out of this. And what do you know? We're getting into the 80s. We hit 90 frames per second in this game, consistently above 70 frames per second, but this is a game that is absolutely utilizing the OLED Steam Deck. So yeah, highly recommend this, and it's very playable at low settings. No complaints here. This is just making me very excited for Hellblade 2. Oh man, looks so good. However, I'm very curious to see how it runs on the Steam Deck. Low settings was a walk in the park, so it's time to kick it up into medium. I have a feeling this is still gonna work very well and be a good option. At medium, we're still staying at that 80 frames per second, easily chilling in the high 70s. So again, even at medium settings, this game is really showing off this beautiful 90 hertz OLED screen, which is great to see. It's good to have some games in your arsenal that can actually utilize that, because so many of the new games, you know, we're trying to get them into the 40-ish frames per second. But this one, no, it's way up there. Medium was still too easy. It's time to kick things into high and give it some sort of a challenge. Even at high, we're staying in the 70 frames per second pretty consistently. Every once in a while, it'll dip down into the mid 60s. If you wanted to conserve battery power, you could easily cap this game at 60 or even 45 frames per second in high settings and enjoy hours of gameplay on your OLED Steam Deck. Guys, I need to finish this game before the new one comes out. I've never played all the way to completion. All right, it is cruising in high settings, so we're gonna go to very high settings and see what we can get. And hallelujah, what do you know? We have a game that you can go to the highest settings and still play above 60 frames per second, and all the time reaching into the 70 frames per second. So, if you can't handle playing games in lower than 60 frames per second and you want the quality as high as it can possibly be, this is a great game option for you on the Steam Deck. But what if you need more frames per second? We can always try FSR at performance and find out. FSR performance on this game isn't turning the imagery into absolute useless garbage like it did in Hogwarts. It's obviously affecting its quality, but it's not so severe, and you are absolutely getting, you know, a little push in the frames per second. We're getting mid 70s, every once in a while bumps to the high 70 frames per second. But again, we were already getting some pretty good frames per second without it on performance. So I probably wouldn't use it. In fact, I'm more interested in ultra quality and to see how that performs. Well, now I'm going to have all the haters in the comments just crying their eyes out that this can't handle the game and it's unplayable because we're not hitting that 60 frames per second anymore. But you know, haters gonna hate. We're all just gonna die someday. Just a giant flame of death will overtake us. And if you can't handle it, you can't handle that 48 frames per second dip, then this is your life.